Hello everyone, it's me, Austen, and boy, is it that time of the year outside, it's a little chilly. You see, I've got to figure out how to stay warm. Let me see my options. That's right, I could stand in the sun. Well, that didn't work. Oh yeah, that's right, I could try Minecraft with ray tracing. I've made a mistake. Video games, they're pretty cool, but what I prefer is looking at them. Video game graphics have come a long way. Mario used to look like this. Over the last 50 years, we've gone from pixels to 2D worlds to 3D worlds to Mark Zuckerberg's fantasy, and it's insane just how far we've come. Graphics nowadays are nearing photorealistic levels, which, considering that this is the best we could do 40 years ago, is kinda crazy. So without wasting any of your time, let's look back at the history of video game graphics all the way back to the Magnavox Odyssey. Many people consider this the first video game console as we know it today, even going as far as to use the first video game cartridges. And the graphics? Yeah, these were graphics in 1972. Can you imagine 1973 graphics? Okay, but seriously, for being one of the first video games consoles, if not the first, this one didn't sell too bad. Released in 1972 for the price equivalent of $650 today, Jesus Christ. And literally just being the most bare bones system imaginable, gotta say, the marketing must have been incredible.
Thank you. It runs a couple things.
The Odyssey was not very good, but you gotta remember, they didn't have internet back then. Their attention spans were much better. Board games were the way to go, and so the screen part was just kinda considered another moving piece, in addition to board games, really. Okay, Wikipedia, show me the next graphics. Oh my god. In 1977, the Atari 2600 released, and it ended up selling over 30 million units, so I think it's safe to say it surpassed everything. Now don't get me wrong, things like the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, and the Odyssey 2 all also existed, but they all look the same. It was just more blocks and a few more colors for each block. Pretty cool, and you can make out some objects here and there, but this was about the best we could do. While it wasn't a huge technological leap compared to the consoles of the past, it was definitely a step in a new direction, an uncharted world of video games. But this is how it stayed for years. Middle-of-the-road graphics that were just enough to work, but not really enough to convince you of anything that was real. I mean, if you show me this and held me at gunpoint and told me to identify it, I would just pull the trigger myself. Arcade machines were also dominant at this point in time, as the concept of bringing the arcade home was generally unheard of. It was a dark time for gamers. I want more. More colors, more pixels, more bits. Yes! This is where the blocks get so good. Imagine the possibilities. Okay, but seriously, the 80s brought us graphics unlike anything we've ever seen up until this point. And while it wasn't photorealistic and down to the pores of their skin, you could make out what a character was kinda supposed to look like. The resolution of the NES was pretty much 240 pixels, which is also known as the Bigfoot caught on camera resolution. The NES was an 8-bit console that was primarily fighting against the Sega Master System, but they look the same. For the most part, all consoles at this point were essentially the same thing. A couple blocky sprites just with differences in games and processing power, which wasn't a crazy big deal at this point in time. Yet, the NES would stomp all the competition in this generation, absolutely flooring the Sega Master System and stomping the Atari 7800. Yes, that's right, they made less than 8,000 Ataris. It mostly came down to the games, and the NES had an incredible lineup of games that they actually didn't look too bad. Towards the end of this generation, you could actually see developers working pretty damn hard to create a better image despite the hardware not changing in years. I mean, I did my best and nothing happened. Here's the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES. And here's Super Mario Bros. 3. Oh, and you know what? How about Kirby's Adventure? Nope, this is not an SNES game. They literally made this after the SNES release, but instead of trying to capture the look and feel of the next generation, they simply went back and proved that the NES could look even better than we thought. It's a beautiful example of old hardware being just as good as the newest hardware if you put enough care and love into the games. And now, it's time for a radical change. The 90s are here, baby. Bill Clinton, Michael Jackson, and workout music galore. What more could you want? Oh, I know, I want a downgraded experience. Okay, look, I already covered the history of mobile games. Check it out after you finish this video. But the late 80s and early 90s were the start of handheld gaming. Now, I must give credit where credit is due. The technology at the time sucked, okay? I mean, it did. But there was nothing better to compare this to. You gotta remember, they didn't have internet back then. Stuff like the Atari Lynx looked fantastic with a colorful and bright screen that handled games like a champ, but there were issues, notably not enough Fortnite, but also the batteries just couldn't keep up because this was a lot to handle at the time. Not only that, but the price was pretty high relative to the competition, so it ended up just flopping for a lot of reasons, which, yeah, that makes sense. And then Nintendo came out with the Game Boy, a downgrade in pretty much all areas you can think of. Let's talk about it. So the screen is green. The games are pretty damn good. Woo! The graphics ghost around and look kind of muddled. The price point at this time made a super affordable machine. Woo! It wasn't able to fit in a pocket comfortably. Well, then they made the Game Boy Pocket, which was way smaller, looked nicer, and it took smaller batteries, so yeah, it cancels it out. Woo! It had excellent battery life because of the technical drawbacks. Woo! It had no backlight, meaning nighttime play was nearly impossible. I said nearly. I feel bad for dogging on it so much in the past, but for what it's worth, this was a pretty solid machine. It's the best Nintendo could do at the time. Yeah, it may not look as good as anything else, and the graphics are pretty awful, I can't even lie, but at least it was a solid portable machine with great games and a great battery life. Stuff like the Sega Game Gear and the handhelds throughout the 90s kept trying to pummel the Game Boy and nothing worked. The graphics of that puke-colored brick slowly improved throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and anything you threw at it just didn't take it down. It was kind of incredible. Now, handhelds were not the definitive graphical limit at this time. That came down to the consoles and the PCs. In this new generation, processors became 16-bit. That's right, 16 of them. The biggest changes we saw were more detailed sprites, more color, and much better sound. Yeah, I know sound isn't technically video game graphics, but it sounded better, okay? A lot of things were happening, but let's start with the Super NES because this had a lot of great changes. Monkey. 3D Monkey. Games like Donkey Kong Country were one of the games released later on in the SNES's lifespan to work around the inevitable 3D graphical jump. And the game used pre-rendered 3D models of Monkey to provide a weirdly detailed look, as well as just being a smoothly animated game with gorgeous color variety and amazing music. Like, come on! But even games like Super Mario World showed the graphical capabilities of the SNES at launch, with beautiful backgrounds, plenty of colors on screen, great animations, and overall a really charming look that has stood the test of time. None of this took away from the NES's graphics, it simply used it as foundation and built upon it, which it's just so beautiful. Not to mention games that utilize the Super Effects chip like Star Fox. A delectable addition, I must say. The Super Effects chip was a chip that was included inside some of the game cartridges on a select few SNES games. Star Fox is probably one of the most notable examples of this being used, and games like Doom and Super Mario World 2 also used it. What did it do? Well, it rendered 3D polygons alongside the already powerful SNES and/or helped to render 2D effects that just aren't normally possible. It was either used to strongly enhance good-looking games or to add new effects like 3D. Now, this doesn't look absolutely amazing. It definitely skimped out on the frame rate for the 3D inclusion, but games like Super Mario World 2 just look absolutely gorgeous. It's incredible what they could do with this. Another notable console during this era of time was the Sega Genesis, which had one too many tumors. Now, I won't hate on Sega too much. Their graphics were also incredible at the time, and they also had their own Super Effects chip to compete with Nintendo. But I won't spend too much time repeating myself, as this info was pretty similar across the board. Everything looked better. They had more colors, more pixels, more everything. This was video game graphics, and at the time, personal computers, otherwise known as computers if you went to high school, you idiot, were becoming more and more popular as time went on. Although the use of a PC was more for work-related purposes or for specific software or for browsing the internet or for, I don't know, subscribing to me on youtube.com, they could play games and they could play them well, but, you know, game consoles were meant to play them, so it was kind of a standstill. Until we get to the late 90s. At this point in time, 3D was starting. Games like Doom pioneered 3D. Created in 1993, the game utilized the Sega 32X and the Super Effects chip and showed what graphics were moving into, a fully 3D world that you could move around in and not just view from above or from the side. And with this, a new generation starts. N64, Sega Saturn, you know what? Fuck it, Sega Dreamcast, that's right, that was born and it died. Oh, and you know what? PlayStation, Sony's joining the action, you fuck. 3D started and it didn't stop. Every game you loved, now it was in 3D. Mario, no longer did you have a stupid stupid 2D map full of dumb pixels. What even is this? I'm just kidding. I love this game. Please don't be too mad at me. Super Mario 64 was Nintendo's biggest move into the world of 3D, with an expansive new world filled with fully explorable worlds that were completely new at the time. Developers had so many opportunities in this new dimension, and this game was and still is a masterpiece. It's honestly incredible how we went from the original Super Mario Bros. To Super Mario 64 in essentially a decade. The Nintendo 64 in general was such a monumental leap, and so many franchises got a really good start with 3D on this console. One of which was Zelda. Not only did Nintendo come out with a fully fledged 3D Zelda game, but they also came out with a fully fledged 3D Zelda game. Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time are incredible examples of turning a kinda sorta not really believable world on the NES into a new, uncharted world to discover. It's hard to understate just how much 3D did for established series at this point. But I'm not here just for Nintendo nostalgia, even Sega was dipping their toes in. With the Dreamcast, they fully made the move into 3D, and one of the major flagship games that came with it was Sonic Adventure. Considered by many to be one of, if not the best Sonic game ever made, which I totally agree with. I mean, come on. Sonic Adventure showed just how good Sonic could be in a 3D environment, and then they threw it away 10 years later. Also towards the late 90s, Nvidia was starting to come out with graphics that were being pushed hard. I mean, it was more than just Nvidia, but I don't really care. They all look the same. I'm just gonna go with it. Thanks. And oh my god, reflections? Water? Grass? Is this the real world? Now 3D at this time, it was a bit rough. Yeah, the consoles were doing great and lots of advancements were being made, but we gotta take the nostalgia glasses off and remember that this looks awful. I'm sorry, but what you're seeing is an upscaled, modernized, and emulated version of a game you remember. It was more like a fourth of the visual quality with a CRT filter and fuzzy look to it. Oh, and don't forget that games like Zelda ran at like 20 FPS. This is unacceptable. As well, everything looked blocky. I mean, I'm not expecting perfection, but come on, man, this isn't really very good. Okay, now most of this is kind of biased because I grew up with the GameCube and PS2 era, but still, this just didn't look very good for a start. The only thing that saved it were the good games. Let's be completely honest here. I mean, would anyone really look back fondly if they just didn't polish the Zelda games or didn't polish Mario 64? Like, come on. Don't get me wrong, they're great games and you can definitely still play them, but I feel like you had to have grown up with them because I don't know if I could do this. Not to mention this controller was going through puberty and has a fungal growth. But then we move into the 2000s. Britney Spears is playing on the radio. This thing called the World Wide Web is taking off. And you know what? Technology, it's fucking bananas. In just a few years, just a few, we went from this to this to this to this. I can see Luigi's ass in full view and it's glorious. By the way, I'm reviewing this soon, so stay tuned. Lighting effects, particle effects, real-time moving water, Luigi's ass. I could not have been born in a better time. That's right, we've reached the era of good-looking 3D graphics. Sure, you know, it's not the most realistic thing in the world. The lighting makes everything look like silicone, but you know what? Luigi's ass. Okay, but seriously, now we're in the best era of 3D graphics. Not only do the models look just so much more smooth and toned down compared to the blockiness of our past, but everything just improved drastically. And there's a lot to say about this generation of gaming, and even though I'm supposed to be talking about graphics, let me talk about the games real quickly. While the N64, Dreamcast, and PlayStation were a great start to 3D, it wasn't very definitive at first. It was mostly just checking the box of, yep, it runs 3D, instead of, yep, this is a quality 3D game. In the early 2000s, we had the next generation of 3D start to show itself, and with the second generation of 3D consoles, they had more and more time to double down and improve on everything. The visual quality was improved across the board, with all the consoles moving to a 480p minimum, practically doubling the quality of the previous generation, with the Xbox even supporting 720p or 1080 interlaced. The Xbox is so damn cool and you're a damn loser. Hardware was pretty comparable for the main three. This was before Nintendo gave up, and like with everything that came before it, games all looked roughly the same on each system, with the Xbox touting the best quality and the fucking rock. I'm sold. So the tricky part of creating a 3D console was out of the way. We've already done it. Now it was time to improve them. On top of everything I said, this was the era before online gaming came into the 3D era, and I feel like that made games more special in this generation. There was still plenty of room for developers to experiment while also building off and improving the previous generation's experiments. And during this time, most games were single player or local multiplayer, which meant that a lot of the experience was dedicated to a solo experience. So any game with an open world or detailed environment is detailed. It truly felt like each and every developer during this generation had so much fun with their games and took advantage of 3D to the absolute fullest. I love it. And even though I prefer my gaming in 4K, I have no issues with this quality. But before we move on to the next generation of consoles, what was going on with handhelds? Oh, it's just the Game Boy. Yeah, the Game Boy just kept having one minor upgrade every year or so. I mean, gotta hand it to Nintendo, they were printing money. First, a smaller version, then a backlit version, then a color but not backlit version, then a sideways but not backlit version, then a flippable version with a backlit screen, and then a tiny one? So now it's the mid-2000s and a second handheld has hit the Pentagon from Nintendo. It's called the DS. Compared to the Game Boy Advance SP, which was graphically on par with the SNES, the DS should be comparable, maybe a little less, to the N64. And it had a touchscreen. Okay, but the DS was freaking sweet, Lois. Games ran great on this thing. The battery life was infinite, and I could just make an entire video about how much I love it, but this is about graphics, this is about graphics, this is about graphics. The fact that this was close to the N64 in both processing power and screen resolution, that says a lot. It also held up pretty well visually. I have no problem playing any of these games, even today. Though it's worth mentioning that while games like New Super Mario Bros. Really showed how well the DS could handle 2D games with beautifully detailed backgrounds and animations, the 3D games were just the bare minimum, enough to meet the requirements, but not making me feel immersed in the world, as if you knew the world was fake. The consoles did the opposite. Speaking of which, what was going on here? The next generation of consoles brought us HD quality up to 720p, 1080p, and okay, really 480p still? Yeah, the Wii was essentially just a GameCube 1.5. There wasn't much effort put into making up-to-date hardware. They focused more on creating fun games and experiences with the system itself, rather than focusing on HD clarity, which, yeah, whatever, that's fair. But the Xbox and PlayStation 3 were getting it on. No, not like that. Both consoles featured a massive upgrade in 3D quality. I mean, come on, it wasn't perfect, you know, I didn't expect that, but some of these games actually still hold up pretty well. I think about this era as the threequel to the 3D world at this point. The first generation, blocky, slow, stuttery, fuzzy, generally unpleasant to look at, but you could kind of make out what it was supposed to be. The second generation, smoother, less stuttery, fixing the fundamental issues from last time, but still with plenty of technical drawbacks, and it was far from perfect. It definitely skimped out here and there, and it was in no way convincing. It just looked way more put together. And this third generation was focusing more on convincing you this isn't just Luigi's face, it was more about the world itself, with improvements to draw distance, lighting, world detail like foliage, physics, and generally polishing up some of the visual drawbacks with clearer displays. It was building up the illusion of 3D in more subtle ways. Now, don't get me wrong, PS2 to PS3 is definitely a jump in model quality and not looking like plastic on everything, but it wasn't drastic like the N64 to the GameCube, for example, which it's hard to tell if these are just one generation apart. Now, games on the Wii didn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination, but HDMI and 1080p graphics definitely looked a lot better. I mean, I can play Wii Party and have a grand old time, but I do wish this looked a little better quality sometimes. The fine details are really lost on some of these games. Though that's not to say Nintendo did a bad job. Like Kirby's Adventure on the NES, Nintendo really proved with games like Super Mario Galaxy that if you just work on the older hardware a little bit more, you can optimize games and make them literally look beautiful. Loads of amazing 3D games came out during this era of the mid to late 2000s, so many of which perfected the detailed and open world like Skyrim, Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Forza Horizon, Halo, Call of Duty, BioShock, Portal. I mean, there's a reason the late 2000s are considered the best time for video games throughout history. So many bangers came out and they came a swinging. Now, there's a lot I could say about this era of gaming, but we're focused on the graphics and this is where it gets weird. So picture this, Michael Jackson just died. And now we're in the 2010s. Yeah, once we hit 1080p, we just kind of, sat there for like a decade. It's kind of the same deal as the first and second generation of 3D. The first gen was starting it, the second was improving it. And it's the same with visual quality for the third and fourth generations of 3D. 1080p in 2006 is a lot different than 1080p in 2013. But for some reason, the 3DS and the Wii U came out way earlier than the rest of the generation, so let's take a look. The 3DS was... It was a 3DS, alright. The 3DS had a slightly higher resolution than the original DS, with half of it being dedicated to the 3D effect, so it's hard to say, but it was basically 240p, a little bit better than the N64, and yeah, looks good. I don't think anyone was expecting 8K quality from this thing. It was mostly just so Nintendo could print some more cash like they did with the Game Boy, but 3D worlds in this system felt amazing. Games like Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon really shined and proved that detail can be super rich with the background, animations, models, and just the general look and feel. It all looked really polished. I also gotta say, the 3D was cool. I know, it's a bit of a controversial opinion, but it had some pretty neat effects, and I used it from time to time. You really feel like you're getting more perspectives with this thing. It just felt more immersive, and I feel like that's worth mentioning. Now, graphics on the Wii U... I expected the bare minimum, and I'm still disappointed. The Wii U supported 1080p, but it really wasn't that crazy looking. It mostly came down to how Nintendo polished up the lighting and shading in their games, because games like Splatoon and Super Mario 3D World look absolutely incredible. And then there's Zombie U. I won't spend too much time beating up the Wii U because it's already insecure. Stop bullying it, you guys, come on. But it really didn't feel like much of a leap considering it was now half a decade before everyone else, and it's staying that way to this day. But let's move on to the PS4 and Xbox One, and I'm sad to say, it didn't really change. When I think of PS2 to PS3, I have a really good idea of what that means. When I think of PS3 to PS4, I have no idea what that means. Well, except for that old guy test demo. His pores look so good. I love his hair. You look beautiful, old guy. Never stop. Yeah. Still though, on a serious note, everything looked the same. I mean, graphics were great, but nothing was being done to improve it. Unreal Engine 4 came out around 2014, which gave a lot of games a similar standard look and feel to them, and it looked pretty good. Later on in the generation, games like Gears 5, Little Nightmares, Sea of Thieves, Yoshi's Crafted World, and Fortnite, I Missed You, are great examples of how this engine became optimized and worked on over time. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves because something new is right around the corner. 2 characters, 4KP. Short for pixels. Around 2016 to 2017, we got a new Nintendo console and we got iterations to upgrade the PS4 and the Xbox One. The PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, releasing around the same time, improved the quality drastically and displayed a 4K resolution. Yeah! Hey, now don't get too excited. Sure, it was 4K quality the same way my taxes were paid this year, but you know what? It still wasn't ready. Games that ran in 4K often split the frame rate in half, and now we have this weird option in games. Either you run the game back at 1080p at a reliable 60 FPS, or you get the extra pixels while slashing half the frames. This was in a lot of games at the time, and it honestly just felt so split. Picture this. I wanted to play Forza Horizon 4 in 4K because not only was the resolution better, but the foliage, the draw distance, and everything else about how the game looked was just better quality. But it was also 30 FPS. If I drove at 30 FPS, I would be dead by now. So when I got my Xbox One X, I excitedly downloaded Forza Horizon 4 thinking, oh man, it's gonna look so amazing and smooth, just to get let down with 2 options when I really just wanted both. Meanwhile, Nintendo realized that money can go the opposite way as well, and so they put themselves together and came out with the Nintendo Switch. Now, this is still a 1080p console. Nintendo is still roughly a decade behind everyone else, and it's not like games look awful, not at all, and they definitely look way better than the Wii U, but this was essentially a stable 1080p console well after consoles had started to touch on 4K. It's a little dumb. But the difference with the Switch is that games like Mario Odyssey, Luigi's Mansion 3, Captain Toad, and Smash Ultimate, they all look amazing. The lighting is polished and gorgeous. The animations are incredible. The colors and the detail in the environment are fantastic. It really feels like first-party games on the system are just things that you won't find anywhere else. They have that Nintendo charm to them. Notice how I didn't mention Breath of the Wild. Don't get me wrong, they did an incredible job with a ton of other games, and Breath of the Wild is still an amazing, amazing game, but it was held back by the Wii U. And we need to admit that. Because the Wii U didn't have its own original full 3D Zelda game like every other console prior to that, and the Switch was next in line to, you know, make money, they did the unthinkable, and they released it on the same day on both consoles, one of which had also launched the same day. Because of this, the Switch version and the Wii U version run and look pretty much the exact same. I think the Switch is a slightly higher pixel count, 1080p or something compared to 900, but it still runs at 30 FPS and generally has the same stuttering and lag issues in certain areas, just like the Wii U. To me, this shows that we got a ported Wii U version on the Switch, as opposed to the game being built up for the Switch and ported to the Wii U. We got robbed, god damn it! Though I'm excited to see what Tears of the Kingdom will do. I'm really hoping we get some more polished graphics in this one, and they make my Switch burn. Oh my goodness, I haven't even mentioned computer graphics since the 90s. Okay, well, the visual quality of the games hasn't really changed all too much. PC gamers were still stuck on 1080p, and the models of everything in game looked about the same. But the difference is that you could run a super crazy graphics card and get a crazy good frame rate with max settings. It also meant you could likely mod some of the games to use better looking textures or models, basically upgrading games yourself with no compromises. Graphics were pretty comparable and still remain that way to this day, but the split is about to happen, and it's gonna get wild. In 2018, something came out that was going to shatter the existence of every single video game imaginable: ray tracing. The NVIDIA RTX 20 series came out at this time, which introduced the new feature to computers everywhere. Ray tracing, in simple terms, basically means tracing the rays of light. Crazy, I know. This makes a game look incredibly realistic because the lighting isn't baked in from the get-go. It updates and adjusts in real time, and you can tell the difference in some instances. Although at this point in time, it was fuzzy. I mean, you could see the light rays bounce around, sometimes there was a weird ghosting effect, and it wasn't terribly convincing, but it was there. Fast forward 2 years to the 2020s, and the PS5 and the Xbox Series are about to come out, and they feature a brand new graphics card capable of this ray tracing feature. And these things can also technically output in 8K and 120 FPS. Holy shit! So all of this comes together to give you a recipe for real life in a video game. Now at its launch, games like Watch Dogs Legion and The Medium showed what ray tracing could look like on these consoles, and yeah, I'm feeling like this is a repeat of 4K with the last consoles. It's not ready yet. It clocks down the frame rate to 30 FPS, which I can play with, but once you play in 60 FPS on normal settings, it's really hard to slash it in half for a minor visual upgrade. It's just not worth it yet. By this time, the RTX 30 series came out, which improved on ray tracing even more. So what was in the Xbox and PS5 was technically already a bit outdated. And with a brand new form of technology, every upgrade matters. So like the last upgrade to consoles, it gives you two options: a really good quality PowerPoint or a really cool looking stick of butter. During this time, I haven't even mentioned much of VR, but that's mostly because I still think we're starting that out. Yeah, I know, the Meta Rift and the HTC Vive are technically way too outdated, and compared to the Valve Index and Quest 2, there's a big difference, but I still think we're just in the infancy. Even after spending an absurd amount of money on the Index, I still don't feel like it's the most immersive experience VR can offer, and I know it'll improve in the future. Like, yeah, I can make out everything perfectly and nothing looks bad by any stretch of the imagination, and the 144Hz screen is buttery smooth. But I think the middle of the 2020s is when we'll get to experience a new wave of VR headsets that truly push the limits. I'm just waiting. Now, sneaking a little bit more into the 2020s, yes, it's 2023, get used to it. We already have the RTX 40 series, which has finally started to run ray tracing at a great quality without skimping out on frame rate too much. There's rumors of a PS5 Pro and the next Xbox upgrade to get gooder graphics, and now we have Unreal Engine 5. I don't think there's any way to understate this. This engine is going to be huge, and it's still just a baby. I cannot imagine what games are going to look like in just a couple of years when we have photorealistic worlds and you can actually play the games at a decent frame rate. Like, I'm so excited for it. It's getting to the point right now where people are creating concept games that look like they were filmed with a real camera, stuff that looks like it was really real. But I don't know if this is the future we want. Technology will definitely progress for us to have these options in the future, but will we really want it? I don't know about you, but games featuring photorealistic worlds and stuff that looks like it's from the real world, yeah, it's cool, but I don't know, I kind of prefer the video game look. There's something about games like Fortnite, the Wind Waker, the Arkham series, Breath of the Wild, Cyberpunk, and Rocket League. I don't know, I'm just naming off some examples, but these all feel so much more fun. They feel more inviting. They have more personality. They're incredible in their own way. They aren't trying to be recreations of real life. They're trying to give you a break from the real world. Because, I don't know, I just don't want to be reminded of the cruelty of the universe when my Starbucks latte was 1 degree too cold. So honestly, I'm okay with taking it easy. I'd rather games like this continue to look beautiful by enhancing the quality and textures and lighting, but I don't think I want photorealistic Zelda, you know? I like how far we've come, and don't get me wrong, I'm very excited for the future, but I don't think we should get so ahead of ourselves. Maybe we're not ready for 8K quite yet. Anyways, I gotta go. I gotta play some Among Us VR. I heard it's in 16K, and you die when you get killed in the game. It's really a lot of fun.